Picture yourself standing directly on the floor of Abbey Road Studio 3. It is 1972. And you are not looking at a rock band casually strumming guitars in a circle.
Right. Definitely not your standard session.
No. Instead, you are just entirely surrounded by physical strips of quarter-inch magnetic tape. I mean, we are talking about pieces of tape approximately 20 feet long.
Wow, just everywhere.
Everywhere, pulled taut and wrapped tightly around these heavy metal microphone stands that are placed strategically all over the room.
It resembles a textile mill more than a recording studio.
Yeah.
You know, just a literal web of fragile, rust-colored magnetic tape spanning the entire floor space.
Yeah, creating this massive obstacle course. And the reason for this mechanical chaos is the opening of the track money. We really have to frame this not as a standard musical recording, but as this grueling, almost punishing feat of mechanical engineering.
Executed by their staff engineer, Alan Parsons. Right.
Yeah, exactly. To create that iconic opening rhythm, Parsons had to pull out a literal ruler and painstakingly measure, mark, and hand-cut 7 precise segments of tape.
And these segments contained all the field recordings.
Yes. He had a tape of clinking coins, a tape of a ringing cash register, tearing paper, and a clicking counting machine.
Think about the physical reality of that for a second. Today, you would just drag and drop audio files on a smartphone screen in 2 seconds.
Right. It's effortless now.
But back then, to make a repeating loop, you had to physically splice those 7 pieces of tape together with an adhesive backing to form a literal circle.
So you have this massive 20-foot tape loop that has to be fed into the playback heads of a Revox tape recorder.
But a 20-foot loop of tape is just going to puddle on the floor.
Exactly. It'll tangle and snap the second you hit play. So to keep the tension perfect, they threaded it around those heavy microphone stands.
Using them as makeshift tension pulleys right across the studio floor.
Yes. And all of this intense manual labor was just to maintain a steady, repeating 7-beat rhythm for the band to play over.
Which, it presents a tremendous irony.
Oh, a massive irony.
You have this gritty working class studio labor, measuring tape with a ruler, wrestling with heavy metal poles, worrying the tape might snap at any second.
Right.
All to construct a track that delivers a cynical, biting lyrical critique of late-stage capitalism and greed.
The ultimate twist being that this exact track, built through literal sweat and manual splicing, is what ultimately made the band incredibly generationally wealthy.
Welcome to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking.
I am so thrilled to be unpacking this specific session with you today.
Same here. So today, the mission for this deep dive is to explore the architecture of Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. We are taking a massive stack of session logs, historical analyses, and acoustic engineering notes to uncover how the band turned the recording studio into an instrument to map the human psyche. And to understand how a band reaches the point of stretching 20 feet of tape around microphone stands, we really have to look backward.
We do.
We have to look at a chaotic, borderline, unhinged experiment that forced them to completely rethink their creative process.
Okay, let's unpack this, because they didn't just walk into Abbey Road and magically invent a masterpiece. They actually started with literal garbage.
Yeah, they really did. So, following the departure of their visionary founder, Syd Barrett, due to a tragic psychological collapse, the band faced a massive identity crisis. They were totally adrift.
Right.
So in late 1971, they initiated a highly experimental project dubbed Household Objects, and the creative premise was rigid. Construct an entire album using absolutely no traditional musical instruments.
So when we say no instruments, we mean they were like tearing newspapers in front of microphones to create rhythm.
Yep.
They were releasing aerosol spray cans to simulate hi-hat cymbal patterns.
And they spent days, literally days, stretching rubber bands over hollow cardboard boxes, plucking them to try and replicate the resonance of bass strings.
Bass strings out of rubber bands. I mean, it's like trying to build a mansion out of literal trash. You can do it, but eventually you realize you just need actual bricks.
Right. You cannot tune an aerosol spray can.
No. So how did they pivot from this chaotic, abstract noise to such a tightly structured album? Because it sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Oh, it was an exceptionally labor-intensive failure. They spent weeks just trying to tune everyday objects. And, in an era before digital sampling, trying to manually synchronize abstract noises was just impossible. The project collapsed under its own weight.
I can imagine.
But that failure was functionally necessary. It forced a profound realization that pure sonic abstraction wasn't enough. They realized they needed to anchor their weird experimental textures into a highly structured, melodic framework.
But if they couldn't even figure out the structure in a state-of-the-art studio with rubber bands, how did they ever nail down the album's flow? Like, they couldn't just guess what would work, right?
Well, they took it to the ultimate crucible, which was a live audience.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Unlike most legendary albums that are crafted in absolute secrecy, this suite of songs was heavily road-tested before they ever committed the final versions to tape.
Yeah.
They subjected their ideas to the pressure of a live crowd to see what resonated and what fell flat.
They premiered this unfinished concept at the Brighton Dome on January 20th, 1972. And It was a disaster.
A complete disaster. During that very first performance, the suite had to be completely aborted right in the middle of money.
No way.
Yeah, there's a severe electrical failure in their custom tape loop playback system. The crowd is subjected to this deafening, catastrophic buzz, forcing the band to stop the show, apologize, and awkwardly play their older hits instead.
Oh, that is so uncomfortable. But that live evolution, night after night is what forged the album's structure. By playing it live for an entire year, they figure out the transitions, the tempos, the emotional peaks and valleys. By the time they brought it back to the studio, the blueprint was flawless.
They just needed a technological environment capable of capturing the sheer scale of it.
And Abbey Road Studios provided that environment, right?
It did. The facility had recently been upgraded, giving Pink Floyd the cutting-edge technology needed to synthesize the specific anxieties of modern life. They utilized the solid-state EMI TG12345 MKIV mixing console.
That is a mouthful.
It is. And they paired it with a brand new Studer A80 16-track tape recorder.
Wait, let me stop you there because 16 tracks sounds incredibly limiting today. Anyone with a basic laptop can run like 1,000 isolated audio tracks simultaneously.
Right, totally.
So why was 16 a big deal and why was it still not enough for them?
Well, in the analog era, each track is a physical stripe of magnetism on the tape. 16 was a luxury compared to the 4-track machines used just years prior. But Pink Floyd was laying down so many layers, multiple synthesizers, massive choirs, dozens of clocks, overlapping guitars, that they kept running out of physical room on the tape.
So what do you do when you run out of tape?
Alan Parsons had to constantly perform submixes. He would take 4 tracks of backing vocals, blend them together live, and bounce them down to a single track on a second tape machine just to free up space on the master.
That sounds incredibly risky. I mean, if I make a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, the image eventually turns into a blurry, unusable mess. Doesn't audio tape do the exact same thing?
That is exactly what happens. It is called generation loss. Every time you bounce tape to another tape, you lose high-frequency detail and introduce a loud hissing noise floor.
Yikes. So how did it sound so clean?
Parsons mitigated this using Dolby A-type noise reduction.
Oh. I have seen the Dolby logo on old cassette players. How did that actually fix the photocopy problem?
So Dolby A-type essentially functions as an automatic volume knob for specific frequencies. During recording, it artificially boosts the quietest, highest frequencies. Okay.
Then, during playback, it compresses those exact same frequencies back down to their normal level. In the process of pushing the audio back down, it pushes the tape hiss down with it, effectively hiding the noise.
Wow, that is clever.
It is, but it required intense discipline and calibration from Parsons, turning the studio console itself into a vital instrument.
And they use that instrument to synthesize pure panic. I mean, listen to the track On the Run. Your heart rate physically spikes.
Oh, absolutely.
They use this futuristic briefcase synthesizer called the EMS Synthi AKS.
It was such a revolutionary piece of gear. Instead of using standard cables to patch sounds together, it used a matrix patch board with metal pins.
Like pushing pins into a board.
Yeah. You would insert pins into a grid to connect oscillators and filters, almost like playing the board game Battleship.
That is wild.
And there's still historical debate over who actually programmed that frantic, relentless 8-note sequence.
Really? Between who? David Gilmour claims he programmed it first into the membrane keyboard, and then Roger Waters stepped in and tweaked the tempo. But Waters claims sole credit.
Well, whoever pushed the pins into the board, the brilliance was really in the manipulation. They sped that sequence up to mimic the Doppler effect.
Yes, exactly.
That is the shifting pitch you hear when an ambulance siren rushes past you on the street, It gets higher as it approaches and lower as it speeds away. But why does that specific audio illusion cause so much anxiety?
Because the Doppler effect triggers a primal subconscious warning system in our brains. It signals a fast-moving, massive object approaching our physical space.
Oh, wow.
By artificially recreating that pitch shift with the synthesizer, it perfectly captures the psychological panic of modern travel. It is the sonic equivalent of missing a flight, the dread of moving too fast, the feeling of losing control of your environment.
And then they pivot from the panic of travel straight into the creeping dread of aging.
Such a harsh transition.
It is. For the introduction to the track time, Alan Parsons had previously visited a local antique clock shop for a completely different audio test he was running.
Right, a quadraphonic test.
Yeah, and he recorded dozens of grandfather clocks, carriage clocks, and aggressive wind-up alarms.
He brought those specific tapes into Abbey Road and painstakingly synced them up so they all chime simultaneously. It results in this jarring, terrifying explosion of mechanical noise.
It is the ultimate wake-up call that your youth is slipping away.
What's fascinating here is that Pink Floyd and Alan Parsons didn't just write about anxiety, they engineer the physiological feeling of it.
That is so true.
The Doppler effects, the overwhelming alarms, they completely bypass the listener's intellectual processing and directly assault the nervous system.
Which brings up the most famous physiological trigger on the entire album, the heartbeat.
Oh, yes.
It fades in at the very beginning of the record and fades out at the very end. And for decades, there has been this persistent urban myth that it is a real medical recording of a human heart.
Well, the band actually tested real medical recordings of human heartbeats. They brought the tapes into the studio, but they sounded terrible.
Really? Why?
They were too thin, too erratic, and sounded incredibly stressful on tape. So drummer Nick Mason simulated it.
How do you simulate a heartbeat?
He took a heavily padded bass drum, struck it with a very soft mallet, and routed that sound through a noise gate to mimic human diastole and systole.
But a drum naturally rings out and resonates. How do you get that tight, sharp lub-dub of a heart from a massive bass drum? What is a noise gate doing there?
So a noise gate acts like an aggressive bouncer at a nightclub door. You set a volume threshold.
Okay, I'm following.
When Mason hits the drum loudly, the gate opens instantly, letting the initial thump through. But the second the volume drops below the threshold, the gate slams shut, completely cutting off the ringing decay of the drum.
Oh, so it just chops off the tail end of the sound.
Precisely. It creates a tight, muscular, rhythmic pulse that sounds infinitely more powerful than an actual human heart.
A bass drum mimicking the core rhythm of human life. But, cold synthesizers, ticking clocks, and gated drums are entirely mechanical. If you just have machinery, the music risks becoming sterile and clinical.
Definitely.
So how did they keep this massive conceptual architecture from feeling like a science experiment?
Well, they recognized that risk early on. To inject raw, unpredictable human vulnerability into the mix, Roger Waters devised a psychological experiment right there in the studio.
What kind of experiment?
He wrote a series of provocative questions on cardboard flashcards, placed them on a music stand in a dark vocal isolation booth, and invited Abbey Road staff, roadies, and anyone wandering the halls to sit down alone and answer them into a microphone.
Just anyone in the building?
Anyone. He started with mundane questions like, what is your favorite color? Just to get them comfortable. But then the flashcards hit them with heavy hitters like, when was the last time you were violent? And are you afraid of dying?
Oh, that escalates quickly.
It did. And the unfiltered responses they captured became the philosophical anchors of the album. Jerry O'Driscoll, the Irish doorman who worked at Abbey Road, provided some of the most profound, grounding quotes.
Wait, the doorman?
Yeah, the doorman. He is the voice you hear on The Great Gig in the Sky, calmly stating he is not frightened of dying because we all have to go sometime.
That's incredible.
And he delivers the final, defining spoken word on Eclipse. There is no dark side of the moon, really. Matter of fact, it's all dark.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. They actually interviewed Paul McCartney.
Yes, they did.
He was literally next door recording with his band Wings, but they completely cut him from the album.
Yeah, Waters and Gilmour listened to McCartney's tape and felt his answers were too media trained. He was performing for the microphone, trying to be clever or guarded.
They cut a Beatle to feature the building's doorman. What does that decision tell us about the album's core philosophy?
It proves that the musical and conceptual core of the album is about elevating the working class, ordinary human experience. It violently strips away celebrity and pretense to focus on universal truths.
Right, because whether you are a rock star or a doorman, you are equally subject to the relentless march of time, the pressures of money, and the inevitability of mortality.
Exactly. And that theme of mortality is perfectly captured by Claire Torrey. The band had this beautiful, mournful piano instrumental written by Richard Wright, but it felt empty.
It needed something more.
Right. It needed a human voice. So Alan Parsons recommended a 25-year-old session singer named Claire Torrey.
So they brought her in on a Sunday, January 21st, 1973, and the band gave her almost no musical direction.
None at all. They just explained the album was generally about birth, death, and everything in between, and asked her to go into the booth and sing.
So she goes in. On her second take, she just closes her eyes and unleashes this wordless, improvisational wailing.
It is stunning.
There are no lyrics to hide behind. It is a pure, unadulterated expression of grief, terror, and ultimate surrender. It is completely breathtaking.
It really is.
And the craziest part of the story, halfway through the third take, she stops herself, apologizes to the band, says she feels like she is just caterwauling, and leaves the studio thinking she completely embarrassed herself.
She walked out onto the street, having no idea she had just recorded one of the most iconic vocal performances in rock history. And for that session, she was paid the standard Sunday flat fee of exactly £30.
£30 for the emotional climax of the decade.
It is a striking detail. Though it is crucial to note that decades later, in 2004, she filed a lawsuit arguing her profound vocal improvisation constituted co-authorship of the song.
Good for her.
Yeah, she successfully won. And all modern pressings legally credit her as a co-writer with full royalties.
She earned every penny of that. That raw, uncontrollable human grief is perfectly balanced by the highly controlled instrumental peaks, specifically David Gilmour's lead guitar work.
Well, the lead guitar on this record is a masterclass in phrasing and tone. And the climax of the money solo required a very specific piece of technology.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Gilmour needed to reach a screaming, desperate high register that captured the frenzied greed of the lyrics.
Well, I dabble in guitar, and Gilmour is famous for playing a Fender Stratocaster. It is an iconic instrument. Why couldn't he just use his normal Stratocaster for that solo?
Because a standard Stratocaster physically runs out of wood.
What do you mean?
It only has 21 frets on the neck. The notes he heard in his head literally did not exist on that fretboard.
Oh, wow.
So for that specific section, Gilmour used a custom 24-fret lead guitar built by a Canadian luthier named Bill Lewis.
Ah, so it had a longer neck.
Exactly. The extended neck allowed him to play full 2-octave bends on the high E string, physically pushing the notes into a screeching register that a standard Stratocaster simply could not reach.
It gave the solo a piercing quality that just elevated the entire track.
Absolutely.
So we have this flawless fusion of mechanical engineering, acoustic innovation, and raw human emotion. But an album of this magnitude needed a visual identity that was just as precise. The resulting imagery became so iconic, it actually birthed its own modern mythology.
It did. Keyboardist Richard Wright went to the design firm Hipgnosis, who usually specialized in surreal, elaborate photographic covers, and asked for something completely different.
He wanted a change of pace.
Yeah, he requested something clean, elegant, and graphic.
And Storm Thorgerson from Hypnosis was literally flipping through a standard physics textbook and found a simple diagram of a prism refracting white light into a color spectrum.
Just a basic science diagram.
Yeah. He brought the concept to the band, and they approved it instantly. The triangle represented the ambition and greed from Waters' lyrics.
The spectrum represented their spectacular live light shows.
And the refraction represented the fracturing of the human mind under extreme pressure.
Yet there is a deliberate, brilliant scientific error engineered into that artwork.
Wait, an error?
Yes. If you calculate the refractive index based on the specific angle shown on the cover, it does not match glass. The light bends at an angle that matches a highly dense, transparent mineral called Zincite. Furthermore, the spectrum exiting the prism only displays 6 colors. They completely omitted the color indigo.
Why break the laws of physics on a cover that looks so scientific?
Because true physics would have resulted in a cluttered, visually muddy image. They sacrificed scientific truth for artistic clarity. The bold 6-color spectrum creates a far stronger graphic impact.
That makes sense. And that visual identity became so deeply ingrained in our culture that people started finding profound connections that weren't even there.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to talk about apophenia.
Apophenia?
Yes, apophenia is the human brain's natural tendency to find meaningful patterns and connections in completely random, unrelated data.
Like seeing faces in the clouds.
Exactly. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is a survival mechanism. Our ancestors needed to see patterns in the brush to spot a hiding predator. Today, that same brain hardware misfires and finds meaning in pop culture.
Which perfectly explains the dark side of the rainbow myth.
Oh, the classic.
This is the legendary urban myth that if you start playing the album at the exact moment the MGM lion roars for the 3rd time at the beginning of the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz, the music perfectly syncs up with the movie.
And people who try this point to staggering coincidences.
Oh, yeah.
The tornado scene visually aligns with Claire Torrey's frantic wailing on the great gig in the sky. The cash register in Money rings right as the film transitions from sepia tone into full Technicolor.
It sounds incredibly deliberate when you watch it. How do we know they didn't plan it?
From a strictly technical standpoint, it was impossible. In 1972, there was absolutely no video playback gear in the control room at Abbey Road.
Right, they don't have VCRs sitting around.
Exactly. The band was overwhelmed with 16-track tape bounces and Dolby calibration. They were not secretly scoring a vintage Hollywood film on a stopwatch.
The synchronization is just our brains eagerly filtering out the thousands of non-matching frames to focus on a dozen fun coincidences.
Precisely. It is apophenia in action. But the fact that people are so desperate to map this music onto other narratives just speaks to its universal, malleable resonance.
And that resonance is reflected in its staggering commercial legacy. I mean, the Billboard 200 chart run for this album defies all logic.
It really does. Yeah. For a long time, its week count was actually frozen because of a Billboard rule enacted in the early 90s that forcibly moved older catalog albums off the main chart to make room for new releases.
But they eventually revised the rules, and the album re-entered the primary chart.
Yes.
As of January 10th, 2026, the album has logged a total of 996 non-consecutive weeks on the Billboard 200.
That is just absurd.
It is rapidly approaching the 1,000-week milestone. That is nearly 20 full years spent on the active charts. With over 45 million copies sold globally, it transcended being just a rock record.
So what does this all mean? When we step back and look at the dark side of the moon, we see a band that completely transformed the recording studio from a passive room into an active tool to map human consciousness.
Yeah, they perfectly balance the cold, rigid mechanics of time and money with deep humanitarian empathy.
You took the universal fears of aging, greed, conflict, and madness and engineered them into a sonic landscape that physically impacts the listener.
It is a mirror. It forces you to look at the pressures of modern life, which, leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over.
What's that?
If this album acts as a psychological mirror reflecting the specific analog anxieties of the 1970s, the physical rush of travel, the ticking of mechanical time, the heavy machinery of industrial capitalism, what would a dark side of the moon sound like if it were engineered using the digital algorithm-driven anxieties of today?
That is a great question.
Right. Would that iconic, thumping, acoustic heartbeat be replaced by the sudden, stressful ping of a smartphone notification?
It is a fascinating thought experiment. The specific triggers of our anxieties change with the technology, but the human reaction remains exactly the same.
If you like this episode, please like and subscribe.